Public transportation has become a spotlight issue lately. Melbourne has been described as one of the lowest densely populated cities in the world, and this has led to a motor-driven society with urban sprawl. However, this is unsustainable, and the Melbourne 2030 and Transporting Victoria have set out a strategy and guidelines to bolster public transportation. We will be assessing the strategy on public transportation and its effect on the residential market. You will hear the perspective of an economist, planner, developer, and community rep talking on the points of land use patterns, particularly in the outer western suburb region of Wyndham-Werribee, costs associated with the strategy, economic benefits and growth, and lastly, a point on central activity districts. I hope you enjoy.
We're talking about land use patterns. As a local government planner, I have a vital and different role to play, particularly in providing guidance to developers on design and sustainability, representing the community in planning public transport and service improvements. All these issues will be rectified in the implementation of Melbourne 2030.
Melburnians generally prefer a low-density, high-mobility suburban lifestyle. Encouragement of new housing closer to existing infrastructure in Melbourne suburbs is required and is outlined in Melbourne 2030. People want to be connected and have public transport and transport corridors. For growth to be sustainable, people need jobs, transport, infrastructure and a mix of housing. These fundamentals are the same for regional and urban development. Prioritising infrastructure spending, but with the view that infrastructure be built in advance, supporting objectives for growth and development of Melbourne as well as the regional cities and towns. The delivery of infrastructure has often come at a stage where residents have already been introduced into new areas, resulting in inadequate infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure. The problem needs to be addressed by appropriate forward planning and forward funding of infrastructure so that people do not have to experience the inconvenience and delays in delivering of infrastructure that they require in order to sustain a reasonable standard of living.
As an economist, this transit-oriented development is going to have a big impact on land use patterns. As it's one of the fastest growing areas in the western regions, it's really important that we focus on providing transportation out there. For one, we know that transportation will increase land values directly around the transit stations. Also, what's going to happen as you have this higher density is you're going to have a mixed use land pattern. So you're going to have a mix of commercial and residential. And this will increase your supply of land available to developers because now less space will have to be used for big department stores that have these massive parking lots that really just take up a lot of space.
Well, part of Melbourne 2030 and Melbourne at 5 million is that the government expects settlement districts within Melton and Werribee. However, this is not viable because, well, people inevitably want to live in the city because that's where all the jobs are, and the infrastructure is not there outside in those growth areas yet to fulfill these strategies.
Talking about forward funding of infrastructure projects, in November 2011, the Victorian government submitted a bid to Infrastructure Australia for $130 million for pre-construction work on the Melbourne Metro Rail Tunnel. Also, just last week, the Melbourne Planning Department has put $300,000 to study the feasibility of a ferry from Port Phillip Bay to Melbourne CBD.
A property developer pays the growth area's infrastructure contribution charge on any urban development within the designated growth area, within Wyndham being one of those municipalities. The charge was for 2011 and 12, between $82,000 to $98,000 per hectare, depending on the four types of land. The GAIC is supposed to be utilised in that 50% allocated to partially offset the cost of important infrastructure projects in the growth areas. However, the majority of funds are still required from the state and local council budgets. The current system confuses the provision of facilities provided by the property development industry and the infrastructure to be provided by governments. Apart from providing facilities on their own projects, the investment and economic activity of the property development industry produces hundreds of millions of dollars in tax, which should be put into local infrastructure. In reality, this doesn't happen. The current transport issues are the result of a decade of a lack of investment by past federal and state governments who were well aware of the development schedules and are now in catch-up mode in difficult economic times. Nearly 25% of the cost of a house and land package is in federal, state and local government taxes
So first of all,
and
let's look at
charges.
it from a numbers perspective. We know that a heavy rail line can move up to 10,000,
Now arriving at Melbourne.
whereas a highway can move up to only 2,500 people per hour. Obviously, we need to be investing even more in our public transportation. There's a number of other costs associated with highway versus transit options. For one, you have pollution. If you focus towards transit, you reduce your pollution and congestion. You also save on car costs. Car costs for lower income families can make up to 25% of their household. And if you were to eliminate a car, that can save you $750,000 per year over a lifetime with superannuation. That's a big amount of costs. There's also other factors associated with it, such as cost savings, time savings, and reliability increases.
Hello, I live out in Little River, and there are no train stations near me. And do you know how much it costs to go out on a Friday night? I have to take a taxi if I want to drink, and that costs at least $100 just to get to the city and go back. It's terrible. Do you know, I'm only on a $600 wage a week, and I have to pay my mortgage and feed my children. Can't I have a nightlife as well? What are you doing, Governor? What are you doing?
In terms of economic growth and benefits, from a planner's perspective, I think that it's very important. Good public transport reduces socio-economic stress and external transport costs.
Regarding economic growth and benefits for the employment precincts, the Melbourne West Corridor Plan makes provision for 2,000 gross hectares of industrial land, which will provide primarily for manufacturing, logistic and associated users. 200 hectares of mixed-use employment land at Tooleen and Tarnee Major Town Centre. 1,000 gross hectares of commercial land, which will include business services, service industry and associated users. Transport accessibility is a key factor in a region's capacity to retain jobs and households.
Having a transit system will do great things for economic growth. They go hand in hand. For one, we see increases in employment. And this comes from two things. For one, employers have increased labor pools to pull from that now have diverse sets of skills, so on and so forth. Also, mobility-stricken households now have a better ability to choose jobs and be able to get to those workplaces with much more ease. We also see that this transit-oriented planning will create business centers such as the Werribee Employment Precinct, which is going to have high density employment.
Change here
In terms
for
of GDP,
Pakenham and Cranbourne
especially with this east-west link, we're going to see now businesses will have expanded markets to pull from. They'll be able to fulfill niche needs, and they'll be able to, people will not have to travel as far to get their higher order services. Also, you're going to have scales of economy as they continue to grow and get more markets unleashed. And lastly, I think is what's going to be interesting is you're going to have increased union enrollment by by making it more easy for people to get to school. I think that's going to encourage them more to go to university. We all know what university does to our population. It creates a more educated, knowledge-based workforce that will have higher productivity and will put more into your economic growth.
So central area districts are based on transit-oriented development, which essentially means that they want to make it so, the government wants to make it so people can live, work, and not have to use their cars to, and therefore this has sustainability benefits, it has obviously financial benefits for the people who live within those areas.
To touch briefly again on central activity districts, each central activity district is different in its role. Local conditions and opportunities, however, are all of state and metropolitan significance. The government will tailor its support for each centre as it develops them.
6 cats already exist. Will Werribee be the 7th? Melbourne 2030 should not be weakened, and policies should be developed which will accelerate development of vibrant suburban hubs in Melbourne's west, like Melton and Wyndham, which are growing fast, and new housing estates like Caroline Springs and Sanctuary Lakes are springing up with more in the pipeline. The west changing phase will require major improvements to road and public transport infrastructure. Measures that safeguard property owners and at the same time promote a diversity of housing and development options should most certainly be encouraged. Analysis conducted for the Eddington report showed that the rail is the key mode of public transport with the capacity to move large numbers of people. The report states that the growth in crosstown movements is likely to be greater from west to east, due in most part to the strong residential growth in the west.
Central activity districts will have interesting economic effects. For one, we know the most profound effects will occur within a quarter-mile radius of the transit station, as this is a reasonable distance a human being can walk. In this area, within this quarter-mile radius, we will find that we'll have medium and high-density residential along with commercial and office space as planned. We'll also find some open space. We know that within this immediate vicinity and around it, there will be higher land values, and these higher land values will attract more tax revenue for the government. It's important to note, too, that this will change mobility patterns of people, as they will no longer have to travel to the CBD to acquire higher-order services, as they can bounce around from transit city to get what they need.
Hello, Julie Gillard. Where are our trains? I have to take my son to kindergarten, and it's just terrible because there are no trains. I have to wait. I have to go park in Westfield because there are not enough trains available at the peak hour times.
Yeah, the state government's doing a pretty good job. You know, they've allocated a lot of funds towards Melbourne-based infrastructure and planning. You know, they're throwing out money for resources, looking into new avenues to, you know, lift congestion to some extent. I think we couldn't really expect any more at this point in time, especially with the unstable government that we've got currently.
Minister Guy has announced that a new metropolitan planning strategy is being prepared for Melbourne. The strategy will consider all aspects of planning, from where new housing and jobs should be located, as well as transport connections. Property developers look for a planning system that is timely, consistent and contains certainty. In a number of areas, Victoria's planning system fails on all three of these tests. Increasingly, there is a significant mismatch between government, industry and community expectations of the consistency and outcomes.
As an economist, I think the transport infrastructure plan is a great one for our future. It really supports how we're trying to move away from mobility in cars, as oil will be the availability of oil will be decreasing to us. However, I do think at a practical level, the government is not putting in enough money and devotion to this project, and they should really be focusing even more and dumping more money into this and less into highway and road infrastructure.